Hey everyone, Adriano Peta from the Geopolitical Mundial channel here, and today again, Monday, I'm going to put up the news that we're going to read and comment on, alright? I believe I'm going to keep this schedule of posting at noon on Mondays and noon on Saturdays whenever possible, alright? But let's get to it. So, as always here, I'll make myself smaller on screen and let's get to the news, right? Discussing the forgotten war, right? People talk less about the Ukraine-Russia conflict now because it's no longer trendy, right? Let's go. Russia and Ukraine are increasing their airstrikes on each other. After a weekend with unprecedented action against Moscow, the Kremlin retaliates with more than 500 drones and missiles. Kyiv kills at least 2 in the south of its neighbor, an action that increases pressure for a return to peace negotiations with Putin. Violence escalated again in the Ukraine war in the early hours of Monday, with a major attack by the Kremlin in retaliation for Kyiv's action against Moscow over the weekend. A total of 524 drones and 22 missiles were launched in the attack focused on the cities of Dnipro and Odessa, and at least 32 people were injured. In the port of Odessa, Ukraine's main port, 3 foreign ships were hit by debris from drones shot down by air defense, including a Chinese cargo ship, because saying China is Moscow's ally implies much more. Ally implies much more. No, it's a partner, okay, not an ally. I would put the level of Chinese activity much higher than what we are seeing with Russia, okay? Russia is helping, China is helping Russia less than it could, but more than it would like, by the way. And this week, Vladimir Putin will meet with Xi Jinping, if I'm not mistaken, he's already there, who last week received Donald Trump. On the other hand, Vladimir Zelensky's forces launched a new wave of drones against their neighbor, at least 2. People died in the southern region of Belgorod, and it also targeted Russian energy facilities. The attack followed the largest Ukrainian action against the Russian capital since the conflict began in February 2022, with more than 500 drones being sent to Moscow on Sunday. At least 3 people died in areas near the city. This action, in turn, was a response to the largest Russian airstrike against the Ukrainians in the entire conflict. Over 3 days last week, more than 1,500 drones and dozens of missiles were launched, killing dozens of people. All this renewed violence comes as discussions about resuming peace negotiations between the rivals are taking place, with dozens of people killed. Last week, the Kremlin suggested that the talks could be mediated by former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, which was rejected by Kyiv because the politician has historical ties to Putin. This Monday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said he believed in the possibility of talks, countering the pessimism expressed the day before by Trump. He had criticized the massive Russian attack on Ukraine. Meanwhile, Zelensky said it's time for Europeans to choose a mediator for the crisis. It will most likely be up to the United States, okay? Yeah, and even if they try to push it onto someone else, the Ukrainians will say that person is pro-Russia and won't want it. Russia will call that person pro-Ukraine, reject them, and nothing will change. Finding middle ground will be tough, so Trump will likely step in, slam his hands on the table, and say he'll handle the negotiations. Zelensky said Europeans should select a mediator for the crisis since the American president is focused on Iran, which could escalate into active war this week. We'll keep monitoring it. Getting a name the Russians accept is another story. However, this follows the pattern seen during the war, with both sides trying to show strength by exchanging attacks. The Ukrainians have mainly been targeting Russian energy infrastructure, aiming to reduce the Kremlin's gains with the war in the Middle East. The virtual closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which handled 20% of the world's oil and gas and an even larger share of its natural gas, led to an increase in Russian exports. Trump partially suspended the embargo on Russian oil sales, which has expired but might be reinstated, and it probably will. With that, in April, the Kremlin announced it had revenue of $9 billion from oil sales, almost double what it recorded in the month before the war against Kyiv began. The mostly state-owned sector in Russia pays royalties to the treasury, helping to fund the continuation of the war. Alright, so what are the issues we need to address here? First, Russia, I still state categorically, Russia is going to win this conflict, okay? The question is, under what circumstances will Russia win? Because the people who are anti-Russia keep thinking that Putin is going to fall. Recall all the nonsense people said early in the war, like he had leukemia or would face a coup d'etat and so on. right? All of that went down the drain. No, Russia is going to win. Russia is going to win. The question is not whether they will win or not. The question is, under what conditions will Russia win the war? That's the important point. Whether they will be favorable conditions or if they will be conditions that in the long run will work against Russia. Why? What we noticed is that the first thing here was the technological impact that drones had on the battlefield throughout the war. In 2022, the impact that drones would have was not very visible yet, okay? We only really started to see that drones were changing the war environment around the second half of 2024. But in 2022, 2023, and the first half of 2024, number first, drones were not as advanced as they are now. Yeah, the industry of both countries wasn't as focused on that as it started to be later, right? They were still experimenting. Also, the quantity still wasn't enough to make a difference on the battlefield like it did later. So that's the first aspect, right? The Russians were caught off guard by this issue of drones on the battlefield, which really messed up Russian operational efficiency. The Ukrainians managed to demonstrate greater efficiency and a great ability to adapt, greater than expected, right? But not enough to be able to change the war, right? After all, they don't have the strategic depth, they don't have the numbers. And of course, right, like I said at the time, and people cursed at me saying I was a Russian shill. Man, there was no way. People just don't get it. There's no way Ukraine can beat Russia. It's that simple. There's no way. Again, what Ukraine can do is create a situation where a Russian victory is more or less costly and with heavier or lighter conditions for the future. Those are Ukraine's options. But the option of victory doesn't exist. That never existed. It's just that people like that thing, that fantasy, you know, of David versus Goliath. Goliath. Where people always root for David, the little guy beating the big guy. People have this idea, and it's not just in Brazil, it's everywhere. But it's worth remembering that the story of David versus Goliath is only famous because it was the exception. In real life, in 99.99% of cases, Goliath beats David, right? That was the case here, so don't kid yourself. Ukraine couldn't win. Even under these conditions, as I've said before, people still don't understand. Ukraine is no longer a de facto state, it's not a functioning state. The Ukrainian government itself only controls in practice two cities, which are Lviv and Kyiv. The rest of the country is already taken over by warlords who may or may not obey the command of Kyiv. There is no more centralized control. It doesn't exist. Ukraine has already been divided. It is already in a situation very similar to what Taliban-controlled Afghanistan was, in the sense of having warlords tearing the country apart, right? It's just that at this moment, these warlords are all focused on fighting Russia. Let's see how, when the war is over, how they will deal with each other and with the central government in Kyiv. But Ukraine is no longer a functional state. Again, the Ukrainian government doesn't control anything beyond Kyiv and Lviv. Okay? Except for these two cities, they don't control the country. Now, another point is that besides drones, which had a big impact and surprised the Russians, forcing major changes in their doctrine, and like in Afghanistan, they struggle to adapt. I'm considering making a video about this. Because they have been adapting their doctrine to include cyber warfare, warfare using artificial intelligence, the use of drones and robots, etc. Trying to absorb it into the doctrine that already exists. But they have encountered obstacles in the Russian high command. The Russian high command has been reluctant to change the doctrine in a much more radical way. They only want to make a few specific adjustments, right, instead of going all in. But they managed to adapt. The Russians' learning curve is a very interesting one. They managed to adapt to this war efficiently, but not soon enough for them to achieve an easier victory over Ukraine. Because the Ukrainians, in the meantime, also managed to adapt a lot, right? Another important aspect is that the Russians, at the beginning of the conflict, even if you root for Russia, there's no denying that Russia went in overconfident. Russia underestimated the Ukrainians' ability to react and the willingness that the Europeans, especially Western Europeans and mainly the United States, would have to supply the Ukrainians. And they thought it would be very similar to situations they've dealt with in the past, like in Kazakhstan, for example, where you deploy special forces at the airport closest to the capital to block entry and exit from the airspace while a ground force moves in by land. And they tried to apply a lot of what they learned in Syria, right? It was, let's say, very similar to the US style of operations, not even talking about the scale, attacking on multiple fronts in a lightning-fast, agile way. And then taking over the strategic points, maintaining the infrastructure, which, by the way, the Russians were interested in absorbing this infrastructure and the Ukrainian industry for themselves after the war, right? So that's why there wasn't much damage in the first half of the war to the Ukrainian infrastructure and industry. And then they went into this situation thinking it would be similar to Syria, trying to emulate NATO-style warfare, like I said, fast on several fronts and lighter, and that's not what happened. And they underestimated based on that and ended up having to go back to the Soviet style, which is the style of attrition and heavy fire on a single constant front, right? That was the Soviet doctrine. So they tried to apply a new doctrine, much more westernized, more modern, and they failed and they got burned because even this NATO doctrine, let's say, lighter, more agile, it never dealt with a country with even minimal efficient state military capability, okay? It was always very much this way, this technique. It was always against either failed states or insurgent groups, but never against the state. That had organized armed forces and at least a minimal industrial capacity to maintain and supply those armed forces. And then it failed, besides the fact that obviously the Russians also weren't used to this new doctrine, this new modus operandi they were using there. And they got burned, right? And then they had to go back to what they did before, right? Or this more Soviet way of steamrolling with a single front. But by then, a lot of time had already passed. It gave the Ukrainians time to adapt and as a result receive a lot of weapons and equipment from the West leading to this war. So if they hadn't gone in overconfident, if they had gone all in from the start, it's very likely that they would have won the war more quickly, or at least taken half the country, right? At least the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, right? Dnieper, whatever. But no, so the Russians underestimated them. Before anyone says, Daniel, you're attacking the Russians today, or something similar. First, I don't give a damn about that. Second, what matters is that the major powers are getting involved, and we just saw that with the United States. In Iran as well. They are getting involved in a world situation that is no longer so favorable to them. So Russia had a big reality check and the United States was there in Iran too, right? The embarrassment the Americans went through in Iran is on the same level, let's say, as Russia, where both the Russians and Americans underestimated the enemy. They weren't prepared for a series of new technologies that were implemented, and now they're going to have to make up for that loss. And why? Because basically, you take all the combat experiences, all the doctrines, the very military equipment itself that was made in the last 2.5 decades. All of them were all built around insurgencies and asymmetric conflicts, what we call asymmetric warfare. What are asymmetric wars? Wars against non-state groups, terrorist groups, insurgent movements, drug trafficking, that kind of thing. In other words, not that Cold War doctrine of heavy equipment, large scale, with bombing, with artillery, with columns of tanks advancing. That started to be set aside in the late 90s, especially after the War on Terror in 2001, at the beginning of 2001, for this more agile and lighter modus operandi. And why? Because the need was, for 2 decades, throughout the 2000s and 2010s, this was the reality of war in the world. Wars that required greater mobility and agility, especially in urban contexts. It's just that. But now, with war between states returning, that didn't work and it caught Russia and the United States by surprise, right? But On the other hand, despite this modus operandi of having to act, of having to adapt, right? Not being able to be so fast and agile anymore, having to go back to a state-on-state war mentality. You can't go back to the era like it was during the Cold War. Also because of new technologies, right? Like drones and artificial intelligence and cyber warfare and satellite imagery and everything else. So if on one hand that new doctrine had already emerged after the war on terror was not suitable for entering wars between states, it also didn't mean that they could go back to what war was like before, to a war like the Cold War model, because of these new technologies. So this created a problem where the states have to adapt, and they are adapting, but they're adapting very poorly, okay? Russia is having difficulties, so I think their moment to win the war has passed. In terms of conquering all of Ukraine, or at least taking the entire eastern side of the country, it seems to me that they've lost their way. I think so. Russia will win the war again, will be able to set the conditions to end the war, but they'll have to accept it. Basically, the territory they have today is just a little more than that, but the entire eastern side of Ukraine, or all of Ukraine, even less. Okay? That's not going to happen. And the United States has a lot of reforms to make regarding this, okay? The reforms that Americans will have to make to adapt to this new way of warfare will have to be enormous. Make no mistake, they have money, yeah, but the thing is, what we're seeing is that most of the population isn't keeping up with what's happening there. But we're seeing clear cases of misappropriation of funds, which at the very least is misappropriation of funds. Which makes you realize that that 800 billion budget actually doesn't produce results consistent with an $800 billion budget. Because there's a lot of misappropriation of funds or overbilling involving the armed forces on a large scale. So no, the American budget, although very large, doesn't match what they could have with that budget. Precisely because of that, okay? I was watching a Senate hearing the other day where they showed a little bag of screws which should cost less than $20. The senator showed on paper to the American general saying, listen, you guys paid $50,000 for this little bag of screws. Does it make any sense to pay $50,000 for these screws? For this bag of screws? We're going through an audit and all that. That was one case they uncovered. Who knows how many more exist? So, the United States will have to go through a reform, will have to go through a series of compliance measures, just like a private company, to check where this leak is coming from. Because otherwise, there's no point in increasing the budget, even as Trump wants, to $1,500 billion for next year. Which will have very little practical effect if he can't solve this problem of overbilling and misappropriation of funds in the American armed forces, right? So, there is money, but that money is not being used. If they solve this problem and manage to use that money more efficiently, then yes, things will change. But either way, the United States will have to go through this change. The United States and Russia will have to go through this restructuring, this change, and who knows if they'll be able to do it. Now, Russia, like I said, might even win this conflict, but in the long run, make no mistake, the situation for Russia in the long run is very desperate. The demographic crisis is going to hit the Russians like an atomic bomb, okay? But Russia's neighbors are also facing a demographic crisis. That's true, but it's one thing to have a demographic crisis in a country the size of Romania. It's another thing to have a demographic crisis in the largest country in the world, which is almost twice the size of Brazil, or about 50% more or less either way. It's a very big country, right? And by the way, 90% of the population is concentrated in 10% of the country. So, the effects are different, and Russia for now hasn't dealt with this. And regarding Ukraine, unfortunately, we are seeing that most likely Ukraine, at the end of the conflict, if it doesn't enter a civil war, will fall under the control of warlords. It's very likely that it will be left disfigured and broken into small pieces one way or another. Or it will be something similar to Mexico, but worse, where the government only really exists in the capital and the rest of the country. As a hub for trafficking of everything you can imagine, drug trafficking, human trafficking, especially human trafficking. When it comes down to it, Ukrainian women are beautiful, and Ukrainian children, there are a huge number of orphans who are completely vulnerable in this cruel world. So the situation in Ukraine is very sad, it's really unfortunate. Anyway, this war won't have a positive effect for anyone there in the long run. Putin's mistake, debatable. Zelensky's mistake, also debatable. Time will tell, but anyway, we can't expect very good things. At the end of this, alright, keep following along. Changes are coming. There's no doubt about the war. Countries will have to adapt if they want to stay in the game. We're seeing these are medium-sized countries. They can already slap the big powers in the face and then go out celebrating that they managed to slap them and survive, something that would have been impossible before the 90s, alright? Thank you all. Take care. Consider becoming a member. Your support keeps the Geopolitica Mundial channel running. It's that simple. Most of the revenue, over 90% of the channel's revenue, comes from members. If there are no members, the Geopolitica Mundial channel ceases to exist. Unfortunately, these are the conditions the channel faces nowadays. So, consider becoming a member. In return, you'll have access to a lot of exclusive series for members, as well as helping to ensure the channel's survival. Alright, take care and see you in the next video.